Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations along with some code for Muroc's Android Programming 2nd edition by Joel Muroc for the AWD1112 or 1112 Java programming class. And we are up to the middle of Chapter 8, page 238, How to Work with Preferences. Preferences, also known as settings, provide a way for a user to customize how an app works. Now, you've all seen things like this before, where you bring up something, for example, anything online, and you're able to customize it. Maybe you're asked when you bring up something, what's your favorite, I don't know, what's your favorite color, for example, okay? So Android provides preference APIs. Remember what an API is, an application program interface. It's kind of a contract between you and the software, where the software says, I will provide you these services, and you say, I agree that I will use the services in the way you intend them to be used. So Android provides preference APIs that allow you to build an interface consistent with the user experience in other Android apps. All right, so the figure here shows a settings activity that provides two preferences. There they are. The first preference has a name, a description, and a box that allows you to check or uncheck something. All right, so you can remember the tip percent or choose not to. The second has a name and description, and if you click on this, it displays a dialog box like this that asks if you want to do rounding and how you do it. So again, an app often allows the user to change preferences or settings. Android provides preference APIs to allow you to build an interface consistent with the user experience of other Android apps. Most of the time when you use this, you're going to use subclasses of the view class to build the user interface. For example, in this book, the tip calculator activity uses the text view, the edit text, and the button classes to build the user interface. You've already seen those. When you work with preferences, you use subclasses of the preference class to build the interface. All right, and that's what we're starting to look at in here. So, to start, you need an XML file in the res/XML directory, like this one. It's typically named preferences, but you don't have to, but you typically name it preferences.xml. Here, in the root, you've got the preferences screen element. All right, so that's what you see right here. That defines a screen that displays one or more preferences. Okay, so what they're doing here is they're building this in here. They're using this to build this. And they're also including that. All right. So first we've got the checkbox preference element to define the first preference shown in the figure. The key attribute specifies the key used to access the preference. The next three attributes specify the name, description, and default value. The values for the title and the summary are strings that are stored in the strings.xml file. Then we've got the list preference element to define the second preference shown in the figure. Here, again, the key, title, summary, and default attributes work the same way as they did for the checkbox one. But the list preference element has three more attributes. All right. The dialog title specifies the dialog box to be used to display the list of options. Then the entries and the entry values specify the names and the values that go into the list. Again, typically those values will be stored in the strings.xml file. When you end up using the preference API, each preference has a corresponding key value pair. Many things that work in IT work in a key value pair. It's kind of like the quintessential definition of a key value pair to me is go into a dictionary. If I want to know what the word perturbed is, I find the word, that's the key, then I find the definition, that's the value. Same kind of an idea. So when you use the preference API, each preference has a corresponding key value pair Android saves in a default shared preferences file available to other activities in the app. Some of the attributes that apply to these preference elements include key, again, the ID used to access the preference, title, the title for the preference, summary, summary for the preference, default, value if there is one. All right. Some of the attributes for a list preference element are dialog title, which is the title of the dialog box that sets the value of the preference, entries, which are the name of the entries in the list, and entry values, which are the values of the entries in the list. On pages 242 and 243 in figure 8.7, they talk about how to display preferences. In the earlier days of Android, it was common to display preferences directly within an activity. All right, but as of API 11, Android 3.0, which was a while ago, this technique has been deprecated. So what you should use is what's shown here. And in here, what you're doing is you're displaying preferences in a fragment. All right, and a fragment is a class you can use to define part of your user interface. Once you do that, you can use an activity to display one or more fragments on a screen. If that confuses you, look at it this way. That if I am showing something on a screen and I am showing it in a portrait mode, I can show things longer. It's sort of like, look at it this way. That if you look at a person and you say the person is like portrait mode, that means they're going to be tall and thin. If you look at something that's landscape, they're going to be shorter and stouter. And that should make sense to you, and that's what we're talking about here. Fragments were introduced again in API 11, which was Android 3.0. They make it possible to provide flexible user interfaces to work on smaller screens to larger screens. So the first code example that you see right here, this first code example shows a fragment named settings fragment. All right, and it inherits from the preference fragment class. It has only one method in it, the onCreate method. All right. Within this method, there's a statement that calls the add preferences from resource method of the fragment class, which adds the preferences defined in the XML file shown previously to the fragment defined in the class. Then there's another example. In this one, it shows how to add a fragment to an activity. From an activity, you can use the fragment manager object to replace the content of the activity with a specified fragment. All activities must be declared also in the Android manifest.xml file. So, how do you get preferences? Well, figure 8.8, which is shown partially on the screen here, and in figure 8.8 again on page 245, shows how to get preferences automatically that have been automatically written to a file by the Preferences API. In the tip calculator activity, you need to be able to get preferences so you can use them to modify the app's behavior. So this first example that you see right here shows how to define the instance variables for the preferences. All right, the second example shows how to use the default values in the preferences file the first time the app starts up on a device. The third example shows how to use the shared preferences object. The fourth example shows how to get the values from the preferences from the shared preferences object. The first statement that's in there calls the getBoolean method and passes the key for the remember tip %preference. In most cases, this returns a Boolean that indicates whether the preference is checked or unchecked. All right, if it isn't able to get a value from the object, it just returns true by default. The second statement calls the getString method and passes the key for the rounding preference. All right, so they can select the option ideally that they wanted to select. Some of those methods, and this is shown right in the middle of page 245, are getBoolean, which gets a Boolean value for the specified key. And again, if it doesn't exist, it gets the specified default. Get string, which gets a string value for the specified key. Get int, which gets an integer value for the specified key. Get long, which gets a long value for the specified key. And get float, which gets a float value for the specified key. So to get a preference from the shared preference object, you can use the appropriate get method from the ones that are shown here. When you do this, you specify a key that corresponds to the key in the XML file for these preferences. In addition, you specify a default value to be used, and that's the default that was shown in all of these. All right. As far as how to use preferences, pages 246 and 247, and figure 8.9, which is on page 247. So once you get the preferences, you can use them to change the way your app works. Typically, you begin by using an if-else statement, and that's what's shown here, to check for the value of a preference. Then you execute the code based on what that value is. So if you're saying here, if you want to remember the tip percentage, all right, so if that flag is set, then you copy the current tip percentage to a variable. Otherwise, you just set it to the default of 15%. All right, the second code example that's in here is a little bit more complex. It checks the value of the rounding preference, which has been stored in a variable that's called rounding. If it's equal to round none, then the code calculates the tip and the total without doing any rounding. When round tip is chosen, it rounds up the tip. If round total is chosen, it rounds up the total. So again, once you get the preferences from the default preferences file, you can use them to change the way the app works. Now, so far in this chapter, as the author mentions on pages 248 and 249, we've learned some basic skills for working with preferences. Now the author says you're ready to learn more skills, which may apply to apps that have more preferences or apps with more complex requirements about how the preferences work. All right. The first thing we've done here, whether you realize it or not, is now we have a line here and a line here. So what we're doing is we're grouping these two preferences together. If the app has a large number of preferences, you might want to organize them into groups, like is shown here. So the settings activity has three preferences grouped into two categories. The first has a title of tip percent, and it contains the remember tip percent and the default tip percent preference. The second has a title of rounding, and it has the rounding preferences. So again, you can group things together. Not only can you group things together, and here's the associated XML, but you can enable and disable preferences based on this dependency thing. So if you notice here, this dependency value right here, it specifies the key preference that the current preference depends on. So you can enable or disable a preference by using its dependency attribute to link a preference to a corresponding checkbox element. And that's what they're showing in here and in figure 811 on page 251. So finally, the last part of the chapter on pages 252 and 253, this what's on the screen here and on the next slide and the next slide, the next three slides, this is figure 8-12 on page 253. This presents a Java class that shows how to work with preferences. Often this is useful if you need to override default behavior of the preference API. For example, in the last slide, we showed you how to use the default behavior to disable the default tip percent preference when the forget tip preference is unchecked. Now the figure shows how to disable the default tip preference when the remember tip percent preference is checked, and that's what's shown in the code here. Again, my goal is just to introduce this to you, not to spend very much time at all on this. We're going to spend virtually no time on this in class, but at least I feel better because, in my humble opinion, you have been introduced to it. Maybe not all that well, all right, but at least you've seen it. Okay? All right. So this finishes up chapter 8. So you should know enough now to get started with menus and preferences, but there's a lot more to it. All right. So you can go to the menu API or the preference API or both, and we'll hit on some more things also in later chapters as well. So when I come back in just a couple minutes, we're going to talk about how to work with fragments, all right, which is the subject of chapter 9 of our book. Again, like the other earlier chapters, as I mentioned in chapters 7, 8, and 9, and 7 was on menus. I'm sorry, 7 was on themes and styles, 8 was on menus and preferences, and 9 will be on fragments. We're not going to spend a boatload of time in class on any of these. I'm doing more of an introduction in here than we're actually going to get in class. So I'll be back with that presentation shortly.